I found the place through a local housing group in late September. I had just taken a job at a dental office on the west side of town, and I needed something cheap that was close enough to drive to in under 20 minutes. The listing was for a basement apartment in a split-level house. Private entrance. 1 bedroom. Small kitchen. Shared laundry and a locked room off the hallway. The rent was lower than anything else I had seen, but not so low that it felt suspicious. The pictures looked plain. Drop ceiling. Beige walls. Brown carpet in the bedroom. A kitchen with older cabinets and a stove that looked like it had been there since the 90s. The woman who posted it was named Laura. She said she and her husband lived upstairs with their 2 kids. She worked from home part-time. He worked for the county, something with maintenance or inspections. She told me they were quiet people, and they were looking for a quiet tenant. That sounded fine to me. I went to see the place on a Thursday evening after work. The house was in a normal neighborhood, not nice exactly, but kept up. Small lawns, basketball hoops and driveways, a few Halloween decorations already set out on porches. Their house had a silver minivan in the driveway and a little plastic slide near the side yard. Laura met me at the basement door. She was probably in her late 30s. Friendly, but not overly friendly. She apologized for the kids being loud upstairs, even though I could barely hear them. Her husband came down for maybe 2 minutes during the showing. His name was Mark. He had work pants on, the kind with pockets on the sides, and a gray t-shirt with a county logo on it. He shook my hand and asked if I had lived in a basement unit before. I said no. He nodded and said the only thing to remember was that sometimes they might need access to the utility closet, because the breaker panel and the main water shutoff were down there. The utility closet was at the end of a short hallway, just past the bathroom. It had its own door. He opened it and showed me the breaker panel, the water heater, and a few pipes running across the ceiling. He said if anything ever sounded off, or if I smelled gas or sewer, I should text them right away. He said he liked to stay on top of those things before they became expensive. It all sounded reasonable. I signed a 6-month lease 2 days later. The lease said they had to give 24 hours notice before entering, except in emergencies. Laura pointed that part out herself and said they respected privacy. I moved in on October 1st. For the first week, everything was fine. I heard normal family sounds above me, footsteps in the morning, a child running across the living room, cabinets opening, water through pipes. It was not perfectly quiet, but I had expected that. At night it settled down by 9 or 10. Laura texted me a few times to ask if the temperature was okay. Mark texted once to ask if the dehumidifier was running. There was a small one in the hallway, next to the bathroom, and he said basements could get damp in the fall. I told him it was running. He replied with a thumbs up. The first time he came downstairs was maybe 9 days after I moved in. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was folding laundry on the couch and watching a show on my laptop. I heard a knock at the apartment door. Not the outside door, but the inner door at the top of the little landing that separated my unit from the shared laundry room. I paused the show. Before I could get up, Mark called through the door. "Hey, sorry, need to check the breaker real quick." I stood up and said, "1 second." I had only taken maybe 3 steps when I heard keys. The door opened before I reached it. Mark looked surprised to see me standing there, which made no sense because he had just knocked on my door. He said, "Sorry, didn't know if you were home." I said, "I am." He held up a small flashlight and nodded toward the hallway. Upstairs bathroom outlet kicked. "I just need the panel." I moved aside. He walked past me and went straight to the utility closet. He was in there for less than a minute. I heard the metal panel open, a switch click, then the panel close. When he came back out, he said thanks and left. It bothered me a little, but I told myself it was not worth making into a thing. He had knocked, he had a reason, and technically it involved the electrical panel. Still, I remember standing there after he left, looking at the door and the deadbolt. The deadbolt was mine from the inside, but it was keyed from the outside. They had a copy. I had known that when I signed the lease, but it felt different once I heard the key in the lock. The second time was 3 days later. It was around 7 in the evening. I had just gotten out of the shower and was in my room, dressed but with wet hair. I heard the same knock, then Mark's voice. "Sorry to bother you. "Do you smell anything weird down there?" I called out, "No." There was a pause. Then the keys again. I came out of the bedroom as he opened the door. He said, "Just want to make sure." Laura thought she smelled something by the stairs. I said, "I don't smell anything." He stepped inside anyway and stood near the kitchen, sniffing the air. He did not look at me much. He looked around the room, at the counter, at the couch, at the hallway. Then he walked slowly toward the bathroom and looked in. I followed a few steps behind him. He said, "Could be the drain." He turned on the bathroom sink, let it run, then flushed the toilet. Then he looked up at the ceiling tiles above the shower. He said, "Sometimes the vent pulls air weird." I did not know what to say, so I said, "Okay." He left after maybe 2 minutes. That night, I texted Laura and asked if everything was okay with the smell upstairs. She replied about an hour later. Not sure what he meant. I didn't smell anything. Maybe he was being cautious. That was the first time I felt a little unsure about them as a couple. Not scared yet, just unsure. Over the next 2 weeks, Mark came down 4 more times, always with a small reason. Once he said the internet router was acting up, even though the router was upstairs. Once he said he needed to check a pipe after the kid's bath. Once he said the furnace sounded uneven. Once he said he needed to see if the laundry drain was backing up. Every time he knocked. Every time he waited only a few seconds. Then I heard the key. The visits were short, usually under 3 minutes. He never touched my things in front of me. He never said anything sexual or directly threatening. He never raised his voice. That almost made it harder to explain why it bothered me. Because if I described it out loud, it sounded like I was complaining about a landlord checking utilities, but it was the way he entered. It felt like the knock was not a request. It was a warning one night. After he came in to check the furnace, I said, "Can you wait for me to answer before unlocking the door?" He looked at me like he had not understood. I repeated it. He gave a small laugh, not loud, just enough to make me feel like I had overreacted. "Yeah, sure," he said. "Sorry. Habit." After that, he did wait longer, for about a week. Then it started again. By early November, I had begun changing small things about how I lived there. I stopped showering unless I knew both cars were gone. I kept my bedroom door closed even when I was home. I put a chair in front of the apartment door at night, angled under the knob, even though I knew it would not really stop anything. I bought one of those little rubber door wedges from a hardware store and used it when I was inside. I also started keeping track in my notes app. November 3rd, 6:40 p.m. breaker. November 5th, 8:15 p.m. pipe noise. November 8th, 5:50 p.m. smell in laundry. November 13th, 9:05 p.m. furnace filter. The furnace filter one was the worst up to that point. I was already in bed, not asleep but lights off. I heard the knock, then Mark's voice, lower than usual. "Hey, I need to check the filter." I sat up and said, "Now." He said, "It'll only take a second." I got out of bed and grabbed a sweatshirt. By the time I reached the hallway, the door was opening. The rubber wedge caught against the floor and stopped it after an inch. There was silence. Then he pushed once, not hard. Just enough that I saw the wedge shift. I said, "Please don't." "I'm coming." He stopped. When I opened the door, he looked down at the wedge and then at me. He smiled a little and said, "Smart." I did not smile back. He walked past me and opened the utility closet. The furnace filter was not in there. I knew that because he had shown it to me during the walkthrough. It was behind a vent panel in the shared laundry room, outside my actual apartment. He stood in the utility closet for a few seconds anyway, then he came out and said, "Wrong panel, my mistake." After he left, I sat on the couch for a long time with all the lights on. The next morning I texted Laura. I kept it polite. I wrote that I understood emergencies happen and I understood they needed access to utilities, but I was no longer comfortable with Mark entering without giving me time to answer. I also said that several visits had happened for things that did not seem urgent, and one had happened after 9 at night. Laura called me instead of texting back. She sounded embarrassed. She said she was sorry. She said Mark was particular about the house and sometimes got anxious about maintenance. She said she would talk to him and make sure they gave proper notice unless there was a real emergency. I thanked her. She said, "You should feel comfortable down there." I remember those exact words because I wanted to believe them. For the next 9 days, no one came down. It was the most normal the apartment had felt since I moved in. I cooked dinner. I watched TV. I slept better. I stopped jumping every time I heard footsteps near the stairs. Then, on a Tuesday, I came home from work and knew something was wrong before I reached the door. My outside entrance was behind the house, down a short concrete stairwell. There was a motion light over it. When I came around the side yard, the light clicked on like usual. But I could see light under my apartment door from the landing. Not one light. A lot of light. I unlocked the door and opened it. Every light in the apartment was on. Kitchen, hallway, living room lamp, bedroom lamp, bathroom light, the bathroom fan was running. The closet light in my bedroom was on too. I stood just inside the door with my keys still in my hand. At first I thought maybe I had somehow left a light on that morning, but I never left the bathroom fan running. It was old and loud, and I always turned it off because it rattled after a few minutes. Then I saw the note on the kitchen counter. It was written on a piece of printer paper folded in half. In block handwriting it said, "Checked for leaks while you were gone. Everything looks okay. Mark." That was all. I did not touch it at first. I walked through the apartment slowly. Nothing obvious was missing. My laptop was still on the desk. My jewelry box was still on the dresser. The bathroom cabinet was closed. The shower curtain was pulled halfway open, which I did not leave it. The bath mat was crooked. The cabinet under the sink was open about 2 inches. In the bedroom, my closet door was open, not wide, just enough that the light could spill out. I knew I had closed it that morning. I always closed it because the door would drift open if I didn't latch it. There was no water on the floor. No smell. No sign of a leak. I took pictures of everything: the note, the lights, the open cabinet, the closet, the bathroom fan switch in the on position. Then I went outside and called Laura. She did not answer. I texted her a picture of the note and wrote, "Was there an emergency?" She replied about 20 minutes later. "I didn't know he went down. I'm sorry. Let me talk to him." That was when I started crying, not loudly. I was sitting in my car in front of the house, still wearing my coat, and tears just started coming. I felt stupid because nothing violent had happened. No one had grabbed me. No one had broken anything, but someone had been inside my home while I was gone. Someone who knew I had asked him not to come in. And he had left the lights on like he wanted me to know. I did not sleep there that night. I packed a bag and stayed with a coworker, Mina, who had a spare room. I told her the basics. She told me to break the lease and not go back alone. The next day, I called the non-emergency police line. The officer I spoke to was polite but not very helpful. He said if the landlord had a key and claimed maintenance access, it was probably a civil issue unless something was stolen or there was evidence of a crime. He told me to document everything and send written notice that they were not to enter without proper notice except in an emergency, so I did that. I emailed both Laura and Mark. I wrote that entering without notice was a violation of the lease. I wrote that the note did not describe an emergency. I wrote that I wanted all future notices in writing at least 24 hours in advance. Laura replied first. She apologized again and said she understood. Mark replied separately about an hour later. His email was only one sentence. "Leaks don't wait for permission." I forwarded it to myself and saved it. That night, I went back with Mina to get more clothes. Laura's minivan was in the driveway. Mark's truck was not. As soon as we got down the stairs, I noticed a thin strip of paper stuck between the door and the frame, near the bottom. It fell when I opened the door. It was not mine. It was a narrow piece torn from an envelope, folded once. Mina saw it too. She said, "Did you put that there?" I said no. We both understood what it was for at the same time. Someone had placed it there to see if the door had been opened. Inside, The apartment felt the same, but I did not trust anything in it anymore. Mina stood in the living room while I packed. I remember her keeping her phone in her hand the whole time. I checked the bathroom, the bedroom, under the bed, and the closet. I do not know what I expected to find. I just knew I could not turn my back on any space without checking it first. When I opened the utility closet, I saw that the breaker panel door was hanging open. I had not left it that way. There was also something on top of the water heater. A small black flashlight. The same kind Mark had carried the first time he came down. I did not touch it. I took a picture. Then I closed the closet and kept packing. While we were there, I heard footsteps upstairs, then voices. A child laughed. A cabinet closed. Water ran. Normal house sounds. That was part of what made it so unsettling. There was no obvious danger in the moment. No pounding on the door. No shouting. Just a family upstairs, living their evening, while I quietly packed my clothes because I no longer felt safe under them. I decided to move out by the end of the month. That gave me about 2 weeks. Mina said I could stay with her until I found another place. I still had to go back to the basement a few more times to pack and clean, but I made sure I was never alone. I also bought a cheap indoor camera. It was not hidden. I put it on the bookshelf in the living room, facing the apartment door and hallway. I wanted it visible. I wanted them to see it if they came in. I texted Laura and told her there was now a camera in the unit for my own security. She did not respond. Mark did. Your call. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then on Saturday morning, while I was at Mina's, my phone sent me a motion alert. The camera had picked up movement. I opened the app expecting to see Mark entering. Instead, the video showed the apartment door moving slightly, not opening all the way, just pressing inward. The deadbolt was locked, and the little chain lock I had installed with permission from Laura was latched from the inside because I had left through the exterior door and locked that instead. The inner door led to the shared laundry hall, and I had secured it because I no longer trusted it. In the video, the knob turned. Then the door pushed again. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, Mark's voice came from the other side, muffled but clear enough. "Hello?" No one answered, obviously. Then he said my name, not loudly, just once. The video ended after that because the movement stopped. I watched it 4 times. Then I sent it to Laura and wrote, "Why is he trying to enter?" She replied, "He said he heard the fan running." The bathroom fan was not running. I checked the live feed. The apartment was dark and quiet. I wrote back, "No fan is running. He needs to stop." She did not answer. That same afternoon, I went to the house with Mina and Mina's brother, who was a large, quiet guy named Andre. Mark's truck was in the driveway. I had texted ahead and said I would be packing between 2 and 4. No one replied. When we got to the basement door, Mark was standing in the side yard near the garbage cans. He had gloves on like he had been doing yard work, though there were no tools near him. He looked at Andre, then at Mina, then at me. He said, "You moving out?" I said yes. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Probably for the best." Nobody answered him. We went inside and locked the door. While we packed, we heard him walking around above us. Not unusual, maybe, but it seemed to follow where we were. When we were in the bedroom, the footsteps were over the bedroom. When we moved to the kitchen, they moved too. Andre noticed. He looked up at the ceiling and said, "Is that him?" I said, "Probably." Andre raised his voice, not yelling, just louder than normal, and said, "We'll be done soon." The footsteps stopped. I packed fast after that. I left furniture behind because it was not worth it. A futon, a small table, a shelf. I just wanted my documents, clothes, laptop, and anything personal. When we carried the last boxes out, Laura came down the outside steps. She looked tired. She had no makeup on, and her hair was pulled back like she had been cleaning or sleeping. She asked if we could talk for a second. Mina and Andre stayed nearby. Laura said she was sorry again. I told her I needed my deposit back and confirmation in writing that I was released from the lease. She said she understood. Then she said something I still think about. She said, "He's not trying to scare you." I said, "Then what is he trying to do?" She looked toward the side yard, where his truck was parked. Then she said, very quietly, "He just gets fixated on things." I asked, "Has this happened before?" She did not answer. "Not directly," she said. "The last tenant didn't stay long either." That was all. I moved the rest of my things into Mina's spare room that night. I expected some kind of argument about rent or the deposit, but Laura sent the money back 4 days later. She also emailed a short statement saying I had vacated the unit and owed nothing further. I thought that would be the end of it. For a while, it was. I found a new apartment in December, a second-floor unit in a building with a property manager and a maintenance portal and locks that were changed before I moved in. It cost more, but I could sleep there. I did not hear from Laura or Mark. I blocked Mark's number after the deposit cleared. I did not block Laura, mostly because I wanted a record if she ever contacted me. In February, she did. It was a text sent at 8:12 on a Sunday morning. She wrote, "Hi. I'm sorry to bother you. When you lived here, did Mark ever come downstairs when you weren't home?" I stared at the message for a long time before answering. I wrote, "Yes. That's why I left." She did not reply right away. About an hour later, she wrote, "Did you ever notice anything moved?" I typed and deleted several responses. I finally wrote, "Lights were on, bathroom fan, cabinets, closet." There was a note. "I sent you photos," she wrote. "I know. I'm sorry." Then another message came in. "Did you ever find anything that wasn't yours?" I thought about the flashlight on the water heater. I thought about the strip of paper in the door. I thought about the way the shower curtain had been half open. I wrote, "Only a flashlight, maybe his." She did not respond after that. I almost called her, but I didn't. Part of me did not want to know what she had found. Part of me thought I had a responsibility to know or to tell someone, or to do something more than sit there with my phone in my hand. The next day, I checked the housing group where I had originally found the listing. The basement apartment was posted again. Same pictures, same wording. Private entrance, quiet family upstairs, utilities included. Only the rent had gone up $50. I reported the post to the group admin and wrote a short explanation. I did not accuse anyone of anything I could not prove. I said the landlord repeatedly entered without notice and that I had documentation. The post disappeared that afternoon. 2 weeks later, it was up in a different group, different photos this time. The living room looked brighter. The old futon I had left behind was gone. There was a new gray couch and a fake plant in the corner. In one picture, the utility closet door was visible at the end of the hallway. It was closed, but on the kitchen counter, near the stove, I could see a small stack of folded white papers. They might have been applications. They might have been lease forms. They might have been nothing. I saved the post anyway. I still have all of it saved. The pictures, the emails, the video of the door moving, the note that said he had checked for leaks while I was gone. I keep them in a folder on my laptop with the address as the title. I do not look at it often, but sometimes when I come home and unlock my apartment door, I still pause before turning on the light. I listen first. Not for anything dramatic, just for a fan running when it should be off. A cabinet settling when I know I closed it. The small sound of someone already inside, trying to stay still. I moved into the apartment at the end of September. It was a one-bedroom on the ground floor of a 3-story building, part of a small complex that had been built sometime in the late 80s. Nothing special. Beige siding, brown stair railings, the same narrow balconies on every unit. I took it because it was available, because the rent was something I could manage on my own, and because I needed to be out of my old place before the end of the month. The apartment faced the back side of another building. That was one of the things I actually liked about it at first. My living room window didn't look out onto the parking lot or the pool or a sidewalk where people were constantly walking by. It faced a patch of grass, a narrow dirt strip, and then the side of Building C, maybe 20 feet away. There was a walkway on the other side of the grass, but people didn't use it much unless they lived in that building. It felt quiet. A little boxed in, maybe, but quiet. The living room window was wide and low, almost the full length of one wall. It had old white mini blinds when I moved in, the kind that bend if you touch them wrong and never quite close in a straight line. The first night there, I remember standing in the empty living room with a paper plate of takeout on the floor, realizing that when the lights were on, the glass looked almost black from inside. I couldn't see out at all, so I closed the blinds. At least I thought I did. For the first week or so, I was too busy unpacking to notice much. I worked during the day, came home, opened boxes, took out trash, and went to bed early. The blinds in the living room were always a little uneven. A few slats near the bottom were bent. The cord was frayed. Sometimes I'd tug them closed, and one side would tilt more than the other. So when I came out one morning and saw that they were angled slightly upward, I didn't think anything of it. I figured I had left them that way. A couple of mornings later, the left side was lifted maybe an inch, not up all the way, just enough that the bottom rail wasn't sitting flat against the windowsill. Again, I assumed it was me. I had been moving things around. I'd bumped into them with a bookshelf. I'd opened the window once because the apartment smelled like cardboard and carpet cleaner. There were a lot of simple explanations. And honestly, I wanted simple explanations. I was living alone for the first time in a while. I didn't want to be the kind of person who got nervous over blinds, but it kept happening, not every morning. That would have been easier to understand, in a way. It would have felt like some mechanical issue. Instead, it was every few days. I'd come into the living room before work, and the slats would be tilted at a different angle than I remembered leaving them, or the bottom rail would be crooked, or one of the bent slats near the lower corner would be pushed out just slightly, like someone had pressed a finger through to make a gap. I started closing them more carefully at night. I would stand there before bed and make sure the slats were angled down. I'd make sure the bottom rail was flat. Then I'd turn off the lamp and go to my room. In the morning, sometimes they looked the same, sometimes they didn't. I told myself the blinds were cheap. I told myself the window might have a draft. I told myself I was tired and that people misremember small things all the time. I did not tell anyone. Part of that was because nothing had actually happened. There was no damage, no noise, no person standing outside, just the blinds. And saying it out loud would have made it sound more serious than I believed it was. At the time, the first person who made me feel really uncomfortable was a guy named Mark. I knew his name because he introduced himself outside the mailboxes one Saturday morning. He lived in the building across from mine, Building C, same side as my living room window. He was probably in his late 40s or early 50s. He had a gray ponytail, smoked a lot, and always seemed to be wearing the same navy windbreaker. He was friendly in that way some neighbors are friendly, where it feels less like politeness and more like they've been waiting for a chance to talk. He asked if I had just moved in. I said yes. He said he used to know the woman who lived in my unit before me, an older lady named Linda. He said she had plants all over the patio and fed the squirrels even though management told her not to. I nodded and smiled because I didn't know what else to do. Then he said, "You got the couch on the long wall now, right? Looks better than where she had hers." I remember not answering right away. My couch was on the long wall. I had moved it there 3 nights earlier. It was not visible from the front door. If someone stood at the doorway and looked in, they would see part of the kitchen and maybe the edge of the living room, not the couch, not where it was placed. I said something like, "Yeah, I'm still figuring it out." He nodded like we were having a completely normal conversation. Then he said, "That lamp by the window is nice too. Gives the place a warmer feel." I had a floor lamp near the living room window. The shade was yellowed and cheap, but I liked the light it gave off. I looked past him toward Building C. From the walkway, if my blinds were open, maybe someone could see a little bit inside, but I almost never had them open at night, and the couch had been moved after dark. I said I had to get going. He didn't seem offended. He just lifted his cigarette hand and said, "See you around." I walked back to my apartment with my mail and stood in the living room for a while. I turned the lamp on. Then I went outside. I stepped into the narrow strip between the buildings, not really sure what I was looking for. My living room window was about chest height from outside. There was a strip of dirt directly underneath it, maybe 2 feet wide, running along the side of the building. Beyond that was grass, and then the walkway. If you stood on the walkway, you could see the window, but not directly into it unless the blinds were open or badly tilted. If you stood in the dirt, right under the window, you could see through any gap in the blinds, easily. I stood there facing my own window and felt stupid. Not scared exactly, just exposed. It was the middle of the day and I could see my couch through a crooked space near the lower corner of the blinds. I could also see the lamp, the arm of the chair, part of a cardboard box I still hadn't unpacked. I reached up and touched the outside of the window frame. There was dust on the sill, a few spider webs. Nothing that meant anything. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. The next day I went to the leasing office. I told the woman at the desk that I thought someone might be looking into my apartment at night. I could tell immediately that she was trying to decide how seriously to take it. She asked if I had seen someone. I said no. She asked if there had been damage or signs of attempted entry. I said no. Then I explained the blinds. I explained what Mark had said by the mailboxes. Her face changed a little when I mentioned his name. Not a lot. Just enough. She said, "Mark can be a little nosy." That was the word she used. Nosy. She said he'd lived there for years and knew everyone's business. She said he was harmless as far as she knew, but she would make a note in my file and ask maintenance to check the window locks. I asked if they could replace the blinds. She said they weren't damaged enough for replacement, but I was allowed to hang curtains as long as I didn't make large holes. I bought curtains that afternoon. Not expensive ones. Just thick gray blackout curtains from a discount store, and a tension rod because I didn't want to wait for maintenance or risk losing part of my deposit. I put them up as soon as I got home. Once they were closed, the living room felt smaller but safer. I also checked the window lock. It was locked. Maintenance came 2 days later and checked it again. The guy pushed on the frame, lifted the bottom pane, shook the lock, and said it was fine. He told me ground floor windows made people nervous, but those locks were decent. I asked if there was any way someone could move the blinds from outside. He looked at me a little strangely. Then he said, "Not unless the window's open." The window was not open. After that I tried to let it go for a while. The curtains helped. I stopped noticing the blinds because I didn't really use them anymore. I kept them shut behind the curtains. I got into a routine where, as soon as the sun started going down, I closed the curtains and clipped them together in the middle with a binder clip. It felt excessive, but it worked, at least for my own mind. I saw Mark around the complex a few more times. He always waved. Once, when I was taking trash to the dumpster, he asked if the new curtains were working out. He said it casually. I stopped walking for half a second. Then I said, "Yeah." He smiled and said, "Good. These ground floor units don't give you much privacy." There was no threat in his voice. That was almost worse. If he had sounded creepy, or ashamed, or angry, I would have known what to do with it. But he sounded like someone commenting on the weather. I started parking closer to my building. I stopped going outside after dark unless I had to. I bought a cheap wooden dowel and put it in the window track, even though the lock worked. I also started leaving the living room light off more often. That bothered me because it meant changing how I lived. I had moved into that place thinking I would finally have a quiet corner that was mine. Instead, I was sitting in the dark to avoid becoming part of someone else's habit. A few weeks passed. Nothing happened. No strange sounds at the window. No faces. No movement behind the curtains. I began to relax in small ways. I stopped checking the dirt outside every time I came home. I stopped thinking about the exact angle of the blinds. I told myself Mark probably saw more than I realized from the walkway, or maybe from his own window when my curtains had still been open. Maybe he had just guessed about the couch. Maybe the lamp was obvious. Maybe I had turned this into something bigger than it was because I was alone and still adjusting. Then it rained. It was one of those steady fall rains that starts in the evening and keeps going into the night. Not heavy enough to flood anything, just constant. I remember because I fell asleep to the sound of it against the window air conditioner in my bedroom. The next morning was a Saturday. I made coffee and opened the bedroom blinds first. The parking lot was wet. The cars had beads of water on them. The sky was still gray. Then I went into the living room. The curtains were closed and clipped in the middle, just like I had left them. I stood there for a second, looking at them. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me had already noticed something was wrong before I understood what it was. The bottom edge of the right curtain was not hanging straight. It was caught on something. I walked over and saw that one of the old blind slats behind it had been pushed forward through the curtain gap near the wall. Not much, maybe an inch. It had bent outward and was pressing against the fabric. I moved the curtain aside. The blinds were still closed, but that lower corner was messed up again. The same corner. The bent slats had been pushed apart. I didn't touch them at first. I just stood there, looking at the narrow black gaps between them. Then I opened the curtains all the way and looked outside. The window glass was foggy at the edges from the temperature difference. Beyond it, the grass was soaked. The dirt strip under the window was dark and soft. And in that dirt, directly beneath the lower corner of my living room window, were shoe prints. Not one. Several. They were pointed toward the glass. They were close enough that whoever made them would have had to be standing almost against the building. The prints were not sharp like in a movie. They were messy. Partial. Some overlapped. The kind you see when someone shifts their weight in mud, but they were clearly from shoes. I could see the heel marks. I could see where the toes had pressed deeper into the wet soil. I remember feeling cold in a very plain, physical way. Not dramatic. Not like my heart stopped, just cold. I stepped back from the window. Then I took pictures with my phone through the glass. After that I went outside and took more from different angles. There were no prints leading clearly to the window because the grass didn't hold them. Only the dirt strip did. The mud showed where someone had stood, but not where they had come from or gone. I called the leasing office, but it was Saturday and they were closed except for emergency maintenance. So I called the non-emergency police number. The dispatcher asked if anyone was currently there. I said no. She asked if someone had tried to break in. I said I didn't know. She sent an officer about 40 minutes later. By then, the rain had started again, lightly, and the prints were already beginning to soften. The officer was polite, but I could tell there wasn't much he could do. He looked at the window. He looked at the prints. He asked about Mark, and I told him everything I could remember. The blinds, the comments, the curtains, the fact that he lived in the next building. The officer asked if Mark had ever threatened me. I said no, asked if I had seen him outside my window. I said no, asked if I had cameras. I said no. He wrote things down. He gave me a case number. He said he could go speak to Mark, but unless Mark admitted to something, or unless there was video, there wasn't much to act on. I told him I understood. I did understand. That didn't make me feel better. The officer suggested I get a camera facing the window from inside, or one of those small alarms that stick to the frame. He also said I should keep documenting everything. Before he left, he looked at the dirt again. Then he said, "Someone stood there." He didn't say it like a question. After he drove away, I sat in my car for almost an hour. I didn't want to go back inside. There is a specific feeling that comes with realizing someone has been close to you without you knowing, not close in the general sense, not nearby. Close enough to hear the TV through the glass, close enough to see what you keep on your coffee table, close enough to watch you eat dinner, close enough to see when you turn off the lights and go to bed. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. The prints weren't from someone passing by. They weren't from maintenance. They weren't from a kid cutting across the grass. They were facing my window. Someone had stood there in the rain. For how long, I didn't know. That afternoon, I bought 2 cheap window alarms, a small indoor camera, and a roll of privacy film. The film was the kind that makes the glass look frosted. It said it could be removed easily. I covered the lower half of the living room window first. Then I covered the rest. It looked bad. There were bubbles in it. The edges didn't line up. I didn't care. I set the camera on the bookshelf facing the window. I put a memory card in it. I tested it 5 times. That night, I slept on the couch with the lights on. Nothing happened. The next morning, I checked the footage. It showed the curtains, still and gray, for 8 hours. No movement. No sound except the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car outside. I watched it at double speed anyway. On Monday, I went back to the leasing office. This time I brought the pictures. The same woman was there. When she saw the mud prints, she didn't use the word nosy again. She printed an incident form and had me fill it out. She said they would send a notice to the building reminding residents not to approach other people's windows or patios. She said they could not accuse anyone without proof. I asked if I could transfer to an upper floor unit. She said there were none available at the moment, but she would put me on a list. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said, "For what it's worth, you're not the first person who's had an issue with privacy on that side." I asked what that meant. She immediately seemed to regret saying it. She said she didn't mean anything specific, just that the buildings were close together and ground floor units got complaints sometimes. I asked if those complaints involved Mark. She said she couldn't discuss other tenants. That was answer enough for me. I started looking for another apartment that night. I couldn't afford to break the lease easily, and I didn't have family nearby, so it wasn't something I could do right away. But I started saving listings. I started calculating what it would cost. I started putting things back into boxes I had only just unpacked. For the next month, I lived around the window. I know that sounds strange, but that is what it felt like. I arranged furniture so the couch was not visible from outside, even with the curtains open. I stopped sitting in the living room after dark. I changed clothes in the bathroom. I kept the camera running every night. The window alarms never went off. The camera never caught anyone. The dirt outside dried and hardened. The prints disappeared after maintenance raked mulch over the strip a week later. Mark kept appearing around the complex. Not often enough that I could call it following, just enough that I noticed. Once he was smoking near the dumpster when I took out trash. He didn't say anything. He just watched me pass. Another time, I saw him standing on the walkway between the buildings while talking on his phone. He was facing my apartment, but that didn't prove anything. The walkway was public. People could stand there. That was the worst part. Everything had an explanation if you wanted one. A man can stand on a walkway. A neighbor can notice curtains. Mud can hold shoe prints. Old blinds can shift. A person can be harmless and still make you feel watched. About 6 weeks after the footprints, I came home from work and found an envelope tucked halfway under my door. There was no name on it. Inside was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. All it said was, "Your camera light is visible at night." No signature, no threat. Just that sentence. I stood in my entryway for a long time, holding it. The camera had a small red indicator light when it was recording. I had noticed it myself. It faced the window from inside the living room. The only way to see that light would be from outside the window, through the curtains, if there was a small gap, or from inside my apartment. I checked the door lock. I checked the window locks. I checked the bathroom, the closet, under the bed, even though I knew how unlikely that was. Then I called the police again. A different officer came this time. He read the note. He asked if I had touched the envelope. I had. Of course I had. He said they could include it in the report, but again, without video of who left it, there wasn't much they could do. He did walk over to Building C and knock on Mark's door. I watched from inside my car, parked near the office. Mark answered after a while. He stood in the doorway wearing a gray sweatshirt. The officer talked to him for maybe 5 minutes. Mark looked over once toward my building, not directly at me because I don't think he could see me sitting in the car, but toward my apartment. Then he shook his head a few times. The officer came back and told me Mark denied knowing anything about the note or the footprints. He said Mark claimed he had only made conversation with me at the mailboxes and that I must have misunderstood him. That word again. Misunderstood. I asked the officer if he believed him. The officer didn't answer directly. He said I'd keep the camera on. After that, I stopped sleeping well. Every small sound from the living room pulled me awake. Pipes ticking in the wall. Cars pulling into the lot. Leaves scraping the glass. The refrigerator motor shutting off. I would lie there and wait for the window alarm. It never came. Eventually, the leasing office offered me a second-floor unit in another building. It was more expensive. I took it anyway. The move happened in early December. I packed quickly and didn't ask friends for help because I didn't want to explain the whole thing more than I had to. I hired 2 movers for the heavy stuff and carried the rest myself over several evenings. On the last night in the ground floor unit, everything was empty except a few cleaning supplies and the camera. The living room echoed when I walked through it. The curtains were still up. The privacy film was still on the glass. The blinds behind them were broken in 2 places now, from me messing with them so often. I took the camera down and put it in my bag. Then I stood there for a minute, looking at the covered window. I had expected to feel relieved. Instead, I felt like I was leaving something unfinished. Before I turned in the keys the next morning, I went outside to pull down a small piece of tape I had left on the exterior sill when I put up the privacy film. I don't know why I cared. I think I just wanted no reason for them to charge me. The ground was dry. The dirt strip had been covered with a thin layer of mulch. As I bent down, I noticed something wedged between the bottom of the window frame and the siding. It was small and pale. At first I thought it was a piece of plastic. I pulled it free. It was the broken end of one of my blind slats, white, dusty, bent at the corner. I stood there with it in my hand, trying to understand how it had gotten outside. The blinds were inside the window. The slats were inside the apartment. For a piece to be outside, it would have had to break off and fall through some opening, but the window had always been locked. The screen was still in place. There was no obvious gap big enough. Maybe it had been there since before I moved in. Maybe maintenance had broken something while working outside. Maybe a previous tenant had the same blinds and the same problem. I don't know. I threw the piece into the dumpster because I didn't want to carry it with me. Then I turned in my keys. My new unit was better. 2nd floor, different side of the complex. The windows faced the parking lot, which I used to think I wouldn't like. Now I preferred it. At least cars and people were supposed to be there. For a while, nothing happened. I kept the camera, but I didn't set it up. I bought proper curtains. I checked the locks once, then made myself stop checking them. I saw Mark only twice after I moved. The first time was from a distance near the mailboxes. He was talking to another tenant, laughing about something. The second time was in January after dark. I was coming back from the grocery store. It was cold, and I was carrying too many bags because I didn't want to make 2 trips. As I reached the stairwell to my new apartment, I glanced across the lot. Mark was standing near the corner of Building C. He was looking up at my window. Not the old one. My new one. He saw me notice him. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lifted one hand in a small wave. Like we were neighbors. Like everything was normal. I didn't wave back. I went upstairs, locked the door, and set up the camera before I put the groceries away. That was 2 years ago. I don't live there anymore. I moved out as soon as that lease ended, and I never saw Mark again. I don't know if he still lives in Building C. I don't know if anyone else ever made a complaint. I still think about that apartment more than I want to, mostly at night when I close my curtains. I always make sure they meet in the middle. I always check the bottom corners. And every once in a while, even now, I'll wake up early and see that a curtain has shifted slightly from the air vent, or from me brushing against it the night before. For a second, I'm back in that living room, standing barefoot on cheap carpet, looking at the bottom of those old white blinds, trying to convince myself that I must have left them that way. I lived in apartment 214 for just under 2 years. It was a 1-bedroom and a plain, 3-story building on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. Nothing special. Beige siding, narrow stairwells, coin laundry in the basement, and a parking lot that always had potholes no matter how many times management claimed they were going to fix them. I moved in after a breakup because it was cheap enough for me to afford a loan. That was really the only reason. The building had 12 units total. Most people kept to themselves. I knew a few faces, but not many names. There was a woman with a toddler on the 1st floor, a couple in 301 who fought on weekends, a guy across from me who worked nights and always smelled like fryer oil when he came home. And then there was Dennis. Dennis lived in 112, directly underneath me and 1 unit over. He was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s, Thin, gray hair combed flat, always wearing the same kind of button-up shirt tucked into jeans. He walked with a slight limp, not enough to need a cane, but enough that you noticed it. The first time I spoke to him, I was carrying groceries from my car. One of the plastic bags split in the parking lot, and a jar of salsa rolled under a parked truck. I was crouched down trying to reach it when he came over and asked if I needed help. I said no, but he got down slowly anyway and pushed the jar toward me with the end of his shoe. He said, "Those bags are worthless now." I laughed politely and said, "Yeah, I should have brought my own." That was it. After that, he started saying hello whenever he saw me. At first, I thought it was kind of nice. I had lived in apartments where people wouldn't even make eye contact in the hallway. Dennis seemed lonely, and I didn't see any harm in being polite. He'd be sitting on the bench outside the front entrance when I came home from work, smoking a cigarette, even though the lease said you couldn't smoke within 20 feet of the building. He would lift 2 fingers in a small wave and say, "Evening." I'd say, "Hi, Dennis." Sometimes he'd ask how work was. Sometimes he'd comment on the weather. Sometimes he'd tell me that the mail had been late or that someone had left the laundry room door propped open again. He talked the way some older people do when they don't have anyone waiting for them, like every small thing had to be said out loud because otherwise the whole day would disappear without proof it had happened. I felt bad for him. That was my first mistake, I think. Not because he was old, not because he was lonely, because I assumed that feeling bad for someone meant I owed them access to me. For the first few months, everything was normal. Then I noticed he was around more often. At the time, I worked a standard schedule at an insurance office, Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5. I usually got home around 5:30, depending on traffic. The mailboxes were inside the front entrance, mounted on the wall beside the stairwell. One week, Dennis was there almost every day when I came in, not outside on the bench, not passing through, standing by the mailboxes. The first time he was checking his mail. The second time, same thing. The third time he had no key in his hand and no mail. He was just standing there, looking at the little bulletin board where management posted reminders about rent and pest control. When I walked in, he turned around and smiled like he'd been waiting for a bus. "Long day?" he asked. I said, "Not too bad." He asked if I'd gotten stuck on Route 18 again. I remember pausing because I didn't think I had ever told him which road I took to work. But then I figured maybe he'd seen my car turn that way in the morning. It was a small thing. A lot of it was small things. That was what made it hard to explain later. If I had to tell someone, "My neighbor says hello to me too much," it sounded ridiculous. If I said, "He's always near the mailboxes," people could shrug and say he lives there too. If I said, "He gives me strange looks," that sounded like something I was inventing because I felt uncomfortable. So I didn't say anything for a while. Dennis started leaving things at my door in late October. The first thing was a paper grocery bag with 2 apples in it. They were red, slightly bruised, with a folded note on top that said, "Too many for me. Thought you might like some." I thought it was odd, but not frightening. My grandmother used to give people fruit from her kitchen, even if they didn't ask for it. I put the apples in the fridge and threw them away a week later after I didn't eat them. The next thing was a small pack of cough drops. I had been sick that week. Nothing serious, just a cold. I was coughing a lot in my apartment, especially at night. When I found the cough drops outside my door, the note said, "Heard you coughing. Hope these help." I stood there in the hallway for a while after reading it. The walls in that building were thin, but not that thin. I could sometimes hear muffled sounds from the apartment below me, a television, a cabinet closing. Once in a while, someone coughing if the building was quiet. So I told myself that was all it was. He lived underneath me. Sound traveled. I still didn't like it. After that, I started being shorter with him when we spoke. Not rude, just less available. If he was by the mailboxes, I'd say hi and keep walking. If he asked about work, I'd say busy and go upstairs. If he started telling me about another tenant, I'd tell him I had to make a call. That was another mistake, the calls. I talked to my sister most nights around 7. She lives 2 states away, and at the time she was going through a divorce, so we had a standing habit of checking in. I usually sat on my couch while we talked. Sometimes I walked around the apartment. Sometimes I made dinner with the phone on speaker. One night in November, I was telling her about a coworker named Amanda who had come in with pink eye and touched every shared surface in the office. It wasn't an important conversation. I remember laughing and saying, "If I get pink eye because Amanda can't stay home, I'm quitting." The next evening, Dennis was at the mailboxes. He said, "Careful at that office. People bring all kinds of germs in." I gave a polite half laugh and said, "Yeah, always." Then he said that Amanda should have stayed home. I stopped with my mail in my hand. He was looking at me with this mild expression, almost like he was waiting for me to agree. I said, "What?" He blinked and said, "Your coworker? The one who was sick?" I said, "How do you know about that?" He looked confused for maybe half a second. Then he smiled and tapped the side of his head. "You told me?" he said. I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. I didn't argue with him. I just said, "I don't think so," and went upstairs. As soon as I got inside, I called my sister. I asked her if there was any chance I had mentioned Amanda to Dennis before. She said, "Who's Dennis?" That night, I moved my couch away from the wall. I know that sounds irrational, but it made sense to me at the time. My couch backed up to the wall that ran over part of Dennis's unit. I didn't know the exact layout below me, but I started wondering if my living room was over his bedroom or if the vents connected in some way. I checked the heat registers. I got down on the floor and looked inside with my phone flashlight. Dust, screws, old paint along the edges. Nothing strange. The next few weeks were uncomfortable, but nothing obvious happened. That was the pattern. Something would happen that made me feel sick, and then there would be a quiet stretch where I could talk myself out of it. Maybe he heard through the floor. Maybe I had mentioned it and forgotten. Maybe he was just socially awkward. Maybe I was being unfair to an old man who had nobody. Then came the jar of peanut butter. I had a peanut allergy, not severe enough that I needed to avoid every restaurant on earth, but serious enough that I carried an EpiPen and checked labels. I didn't keep peanut products in my apartment. One Sunday night, I was on the phone with my sister while making a grocery list. I had the fridge open and was complaining that the store was always out of the almond butter I liked. I said, "I swear, if they only have peanut butter again, I'm going to lose it." The next morning, there was a small jar of almond butter outside my door. No bag, no note, just sitting there against the frame. I didn't touch it at first. I stood in the hallway with my keys still in my hand and stared at it. Then I went back inside, got a plastic grocery bag, wrapped it around the jar, and put it in the trash chute at the end of the hall. I called the property office that afternoon from work. The woman who answered was named Carol. She was always very pleasant in that tired office manager way. I told her I had a concern about another tenant. I explained that Dennis from 112 had been leaving items at my door and seemed to know things I hadn't told him. There was a pause. Then she said, "Dennis is harmless. Not, that sounds concerning. Not, we'll talk to him. Just, Dennis is harmless." She told me he had lived there for 15 years. She said he was retired. She said he liked to help people. She said they'd never had any serious complaints. I asked if someone could at least tell him not to leave things at my door. She sighed in a way that was quiet but obvious. "I can mention it," she said. "But I really don't think there's anything to worry about." I wanted to ask her how she knew that. I didn't after that. Dennis stopped leaving gifts for about 2 weeks. He also stopped standing by the mailboxes. For a while, I felt relieved. Then I started seeing him in the parking lot instead. Not every day, just enough that I noticed. I'd pull in after work, and he'd be outside by the dumpsters with one small bag of trash, or sitting in his parked car with the engine off, or walking slowly along the side of the building like he was checking the windows. If he saw me looking, he would wave. I stopped answering. I hated how childish it felt. I was a grown adult, walking quickly through a parking lot because an old man might say hello to me. But by then, something in me had shifted. I no longer felt guilty for being rude. I felt angry that I had to think about him at all. I started changing little things. I stopped taking calls on speaker. I bought a white noise machine and kept it running near the floor by the couch. I put a rolled towel against the bottom of my apartment door because I didn't like the gap underneath it. I also bought one of those cheap doorbell cameras that attaches with adhesive. Management didn't allow permanent installations, but I figured if they complained, I'd rather have that argument than keep wondering what was happening outside my door. The camera worked for 3 days. On the fourth morning, the app showed it had gone offline around 2:12 a.m. When I opened my door, the camera was gone. Not broken, gone. There was a faint, sticky rectangle on the door where it had been. I went downstairs to the management office the minute it opened. Carol wasn't there. A younger man named Brian was filling in. I told him someone had removed a camera from my door during the night. I told him I believed it was Dennis. Brian asked if the camera had recorded anything. I said it went offline. He asked if I had permission to install it. I said that wasn't the point. He said he understood, but cameras in the hallway created privacy issues. I remember staring at him and thinking, "You're more upset about the camera than about someone taking it." He said he would make a note. That was the exact phrase. A note. I filed a police report, mostly for my own sanity. An officer came by, took my statement, and asked if I had proof it was Dennis. I said no. He asked if Dennis had threatened me. I said no. He asked if Dennis had tried to enter my apartment. I said I didn't know. The officer was polite. He wasn't dismissive exactly, but there was nothing for him to do. He told me to keep documenting everything. So I did. I made a note in my phone every time I saw Dennis waiting somewhere, every time he said something strange, every time something appeared near my door. December 4th, 5:41 p.m. Dennis standing by mailboxes, did not check mail. December 9th, 7:20 p.m. Heard slow footsteps outside door. Looked through peephole, no one there. December 11th, 6:05 p.m. Dennis in parking lot, sitting in car, lights off. December 14th. Found folded newspaper article outside door about a local break-in. No note. By January, I was sleeping badly. The worst part was that nothing happened all at once. There was no clear event I could point to and say, "This is the moment." It was more like living with a stain that kept spreading slowly across the wall. I started spending more nights at my boyfriend's place. His name was Mark, and he lived about 20 minutes away. We hadn't been dating very long, so I didn't want to turn his apartment into my refuge. But eventually I told him most of it. He believed me, but in the way people believe something they haven't felt. He said, "That's creepy." Then he said, "Do you want me to talk to him?" I said no immediately, because I knew how it would sound. A younger man confronting an elderly tenant who hadn't technically done anything. I also worried it would make Dennis angry, and by then I had no idea what he was capable of. Mark offered to stay over, but I didn't like that either. I didn't want Dennis to know more about my life than he already did. One night, while Mark was there, we were sitting on my couch with the TV low. Around 10:30, there was a soft knock at the door. Not a normal knock. Just 2 taps near the bottom of the door. Mark looked at me. I didn't move. A few seconds passed. Then there were 2 more taps, lower this time. Mark stood up, but I grabbed his wrist and shook my head. We waited. Eventually, we heard slow footsteps moving down the hallway. Mark went to the peephole, but whoever it was had already turned the corner toward the stairs. The next morning, there was a scratch on the outside of the door, low to the ground. It was about 6 inches long. I couldn't prove it hadn't been there before. That sentence became the story of that apartment. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't prove he listened. I couldn't prove he waited for me. I couldn't prove he took the camera. I couldn't prove he knocked. I couldn't prove the gifts were meant to make me feel watched, and not just some confused attempt at kindness. In late January, I went to the office again and asked about transferring units. Carol said nothing was available. She suggested I renew my lease early if I wanted to lock in my rent. I asked if they had spoken to Dennis. She said we reminded him about respecting neighbors' boundaries. I asked what he said. She told me he seemed very hurt. I remember that word clearly. Hurt. Like I had done something to him. After that, Dennis didn't speak to me at all. For about a month, he acted like I didn't exist. If we crossed paths, he looked past me. If I came in through the front entrance and he was near the mailboxes, he walked away without a word. It should have felt better, but it didn't. It felt deliberate, like he was showing me he could choose when to be present and when not to be. The last straw happened on a Thursday in March. I had been at work that morning when the power went out in our office building. A transformer had blown somewhere nearby, and after an hour of everyone sitting around with no internet, my manager told us to go home and work remotely if we could. It was around 1:15 p.m. when I pulled into the apartment parking lot. That was unusual. I never came home in the middle of the day. The lot was almost empty. A delivery truck was parked near the far entrance. Dennis's car was in its usual spot. I remember feeling relieved when I saw no one outside. I went in through the front door, checked my mailbox out of habit, and walked upstairs. The hallway was quiet. When I reached my door, I stopped. My doormat was turned sideways. It was usually centered in front of the door, parallel to the threshold. I was particular about it because the hallway carpet was old and uneven, and if the mat shifted too much, the door would catch on it. Now it had been rotated 90 degrees, not kicked aside, not pushed crooked, turned sideways with the long edge pressed against the door. At first I just thought, that's strange. Then I saw the marks, 2 shallow dents in the mat, near the center. They looked like pressure marks from knees. There was also a faint scuff on the lower part of the door, right where the gap was. The rolled towel I kept inside was still there, pushed tight against the bottom. I stood there holding my laptop bag and lunch container, and for several seconds I couldn't make myself move. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow. I looked toward the stairs. Nothing. I looked toward the other end of the hall. Nothing. Then, from inside my apartment, my phone started ringing. I had left it charging on the kitchen counter that morning. The sound came through the door, muffled but clear. I don't know why that scared me so much. Maybe because I imagined someone kneeling there, face near the floor, listening while my phone rang inside an empty apartment. Maybe because the mat hadn't been like that when I left. Maybe because I realized whoever had been there had expected me not to come home until after 5. I did not open the door. I backed away slowly, went downstairs, and sat in my car. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't get the key into the ignition at first. I called Mark. He left work and came straight over. While I waited, I watched the front entrance. About 15 minutes later, Dennis came out. He was wearing his gray coat and carrying a small canvas grocery bag. He didn't look around. He didn't hurry. He walked to his car, put the bag in the passenger seat, and got in. Before he started the engine, he looked up. Not at the building. At my car. Directly at me. I don't know how long we looked at each other, probably only a few seconds. Then he smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't theatrical or strange. It was small. Familiar. Like we were sharing a private joke. Then he drove away. Mark arrived a few minutes after that. We went upstairs together. He took pictures of the mat, the door, the scuff. He checked inside the apartment before I went in. Nothing was missing. Nothing looked disturbed. But near the front door on the inside, the towel I kept against the gap was damp, just in one small spot. I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't want to know. I packed a bag and left with Mark that day. I never slept in that apartment again. Breaking the lease was a long, frustrating process. Management acted like I was overreacting until I used the words police report and tenant safety in an email and copied the regional property manager. After that, they agreed to let me out with a fee. Not no fee. A fee, I paid it. 2 weeks later, Mark and I went back with a rental van and 2 friends to get the rest of my things. We did it on a Saturday morning. I had warned everyone about Dennis, but none of us saw him. His blinds were closed. His car was gone. The move took 3 hours. While we were carrying out the last boxes, the woman from the first floor came outside with her toddler. She watched us for a little while, then asked if I was moving because of the man downstairs. I asked her what she meant. She looked uncomfortable and said, "He listens." That was all. Then she picked up her child and went back inside. I think about that more than I want to. I think about how many people in that building knew something was wrong but had learned to live around it. I think about Carol saying he was harmless. I think about him repeating Amanda's name. I think about the almond butter. Most of all, I think about the doormat. A turned doormat is not evidence of anything, really. If you tried to explain it to someone who didn't already understand, they might tell you it was the wind, or a delivery person, or maintenance, or your own imagination filling in gaps. But I know what I saw. I know what it looked like when I came home early. It looked like someone had been kneeling outside my door, not knocking, not leaving a gift. Just kneeling there, listening. And the part I still have trouble saying out loud is this. If the power hadn't gone out at work that day, I would have come home at 5:30 like always. I would have seen the mat straightened again. I would have opened my door. I would have gone inside. And I would have never known